I hope everyone had a good break, well caffeinated, hydrated, whatever. So our next session is a panel discussion on sustainability in supply chains. And I need everyone to take their seats, but if you're not in your seat yet, at least try to quiet it down a little bit. I could do the kindergarten, I'll clap once, raise your hand if you hear me, maybe. Okay. So we're going to talk about sustainability in supply chains. I'm just going to introduce our moderator briefly, Kathrin Winkler, who is the VP of Sustainability at EMC and Chief Sustainability Officer. Kathrin's a true leader in the field of sustainability. I think she's inspired many of us. And she is going to lead this panel. And so I'd like to invite her and the panelists up. Kathrin, you can then introduce the panel and the panelists.
I'll do that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. So I think that the sustainability world is a mutually inspiring one, and so I have Bill to thank for much inspiration as well as many of my other peers in the audience here. So thank you. We're here to talk about, in theory, about sustainability in the complex global supply chain. And I decided this morning, much I'm sure to Alyssa's dismay, even though I was part of naming this, that we misnamed it. I think we should call it sustainability in the global supply system. So first of all, as everybody knows, the supply chain is not linear, right? In fact, one of my peers, one of my mentors, once said that our supply chain in the IT industry is so complex it has infinite loops in it. I think that's actually true. But the other problem with talking about it as a supply chain is we tend to talk about it as links, one link after another. And we spend a lot of time talking about how one link can force another link to behave differently. What we want to do today is look at the supply system as a system and understand how things that we do at one end cause impacts at the other. Couple of premises I want to put out for you. First of all, there's been much in the media in the last couple of years about supply chain evils, about how corporations are soulless and inhumane. My least favorite quote, I think, was from a press release about conflict minerals that said, corporations want to make profits from the rape and murder of women and children. So I work with a lot of amazing people in our supply chain at EMC and in the supply chain throughout our industry and throughout multiple industries. And I'm going to tell you there may be a psychopath in there somewhere, but for the most part, we really are trying to have a positive impact. And if you think that corporations are evil, I'll ask you to suspend disbelief for the purposes of this panel so that we can look forward. Now, the second part is the other part, which is we still have a lot of travesties performed in the supply chain in the service of business. I'm sure many of you have been to many sustainability conferences where one company after another stands up and breaks their arm patting themselves on the back for how great they are and then explains how everything that's still wrong isn't their fault. That's not what we want to do today here either. So if you think that the concept of extended producer responsibility and supply chain responsibility doesn't make sense, well, then I ask you to suspend disbelief on that also. So what we really want to do today is talk about the problems that exist, how we're moving forward, what the potential solutions are, and especially how companies can look at their own behavior and understand how it's impacting social and environmental responsibility in the supply chain. And we were lucky enough to get, thank goodness, all this help from Facebook, a spectacular panel that represents multiple sides of the issues. We have, from my immediate left, Dan Viederman, CEO of Verité, Michael Kobori, Vice President of Sustainability from Levi's, Heather Francis from LaborLink, a really interesting perspective that we're going to hear from Heather, and Bruce Clafter from Flextronics, Vice President of Sustainability there as well. And what's interesting is we have civil society, we have private industry. We have electronics and the apparel industry, both of which are very much a focus of what's happening in supply chains these days. We have customers and supplier. So we really can look at it from the perspective. We are missing some really important stakeholders, though, and I think we're going to hear about that. What I'd like to do is ask each panelist to spend 3 minutes introducing himself or herself, explaining their role, and maybe giving us a hint into what's on the horizon for supply chain social and environmental responsibility. So Dan?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Dan Biederman. I am the CEO of Verité. Verité is a now almost 20-year-old nonprofit organization that since the mid-90s, sort of the advent of the modern anti-sweatshop movement, has been working with companies to help them understand the labor rights problems, some might say abuses, that are going on in their supply chains, and then to take steps to help them solve those problems. We have worked with several of the people on this panel. We have worked with the apparel sector, which was one of the early adopters, with companies in the electronics sector, which came to this a little bit later. We do a lot of work with construction companies. We do work with agricultural companies. And one of the hallmarks, I guess, of the sort of 20 years of experience that we've had is that the first decade was kind of getting companies, in particular the private sector, to be aware that there was a problem against, in many cases, a great deal of resistance. The next decade leading up till about now was getting a deeper understanding both within companies and within civil society of the complexity of the problem, that it's not just from the civil society perspective a matter of getting Levi's to take a new policy and change everything in its supply chain. It doesn't work that simply. It's much more complex than that. And getting companies to understand that, in fact, the risks that they were facing in their supply chains were much more complex than even they knew. They involved a lot of third parties, for example, not just their suppliers. And so I guess I'm hopeful that the next decade will be the good one or I guess one of the good ones of Peter's curves, the exponential scaling of good practice, where multinationals, not just the ones that are already aware of these problems and taking steps to deal with them, like the ones on this panel, but those that have yet to emerge from the shadows of bad practice will begin to adopt at some scale the tools and the technologies and the approaches that have been proven to work over the first 20 or so years of the modern anti-sweatshop movement.
Thank you for starting us on an optimistic curve. Michael?
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Kobori, and I'm Vice President of Sustainability at Levi Strauss & Company, and that means I'm responsible for labor, health and safety, and environmental programs throughout our supply system. And that includes about 500 manufacturing facilities in 40 countries around the world, about 100 fabric mills, and literally tens of thousands of cotton growers all around the world. I'm also responsible for sustainability strategy at the company as well, and I report to the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Levi's, so structure is important, and so I'm part of operations, so embedded right in to the group that's responsible for sourcing our product. Just to give you a bit of context, I would say Levi's was the first multinational company to actually come up with what we now call a global code of conduct for labor, health and safety and environmental standards. That was back in 1991. So we've had over 20 years of kind of being a part of this whole evolution from, how do you go out and monitor your factories for compliance, to NGOs wanted to do independent monitoring of your factories to check you, to multi-stakeholder initiatives, to vendor ownership, to now industry collaboration on a lot of these issues. So really have seen a lot of evolution over the years. And I would say, as I think about the future, the two things that I would call out, one is we're in the process of shifting, or we're trying to shift our vendors from this notion of compliance to our standards, right? How do we make sure that our vendors are not violating people's rights? Like 20 years ago, that was innovative. Today, we have to do it, right? It's the basic requirement. But how do we shift from that to improving workers' lives, improving workers' well-being? So how do we shift from this notion of compliance with the basic, don't violate people's rights, to improving their lives? And how do we use incentives to get there, rather than the threat to our vendors of saying, oh, we're going to pull our business from you if you don't comply? So how do we create the incentives to do that? I think the other challenge we're facing, and we're going to face, is simply driven by technology and media, which is extended producer responsibility. and our responsibility all the way back up the supply chain, the supply system to the cotton growers. And how can we, many, many steps removed, be responsible for what's going on there? And how can we influence and impact that, even though we don't have that direct influence? So that's another challenge that I think we're all looking at these days.
It does sometimes feel like pushing a string, doesn't it? Heather.
My name is Heather Franzese. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit social enterprise behind the LaborLink platform, and we're kind of the disruptors, the upstarts in this space. We exist because workers around the world now have phones. So we have this incredible technology that we can connect directly with them in real time. Even if you don't work on supply chain stuff, if you are wearing clothes, if you have a phone in your pocket, I think that's everyone here today. You're connected to millions of workers around the world, and through mobile technology, we have the ability to hear directly from them. Our vision is a world where every worker has a free and anonymous channel to be able to report directly to companies, but eventually could be to consumers as well, about their working conditions and needs in real time. And we're working with a number of very large companies and thinking about how can we scale this model to really drive improvement, not just to know what's going on in factories every day that was previously invisible, but then through that knowing how to actually drive meaningful improvement.
Wonderful.
Good morning, everybody. Bruce Clafter from Flextronics. Just a couple of words about Flextronics. We've been in the Valley here for quite some time, but we're a little bit of a stealthy company because we're business to business strictly. And so while we work for all the major companies represented in this room who are in the hardware side of things, and many others, very few people know much about us. So $26 billion in revenue last year and thousands of products. We have 85 of our own factories, 200,000 people, 30 countries. So as somebody remarked when I was out in the hallway, we're sort of in the middle here. We're a major supplier to so many companies, but we're also running our own very complex supply chain that Kathrin referred to. Approximately 14,000 suppliers and hundreds of thousands of components in our parts numbering system at any one time. So scale is definitely a tremendous issue. And I guess I would just highlight two things, for further discussion here. Number one, I would certainly echo what Dan and Michael and Heather have commented about in terms of improving the lives of workers and communication as one means of doing so. We've been working on some issues ourselves in South Asia for the last number of months, and I think the lesson it drove home to us was that we really did not comprehend and understand those issues because we were not really communicating effectively with those workers. And there is a dynamic that goes on when you're dealing with lower skilled workers, many of whom are receiving minimum wage. They don't feel free to communicate, the issues that are affecting their lives. And so we have to come up with more innovative ways of uncovering that sort of information. The other thing I would highlight is really just about the whole paradigm about consumption. It drives our business and so many others, but we produce a lot of products in this world, and most of them tend to get discarded. And so perhaps we could talk a little bit about the circular economy concepts and the notions that we can use our resources in a much more efficient manner, very much in the vein of Peter's keynote address this morning.
I'd like to do that. That's a really good point. Let's make sure we get to that. Let's start a little bit. For those who are not that familiar, particularly with the supply chains in these two industries, with what some of the challenges are that we're facing now, particularly the ones that are so difficult because they're hidden, they're hard to find, you don't see them, you can't tell if they're happening, or because the harm is so egregious, or because they're intransigent in some other way, the ones that really keep you up. And Bruce, since you started talking about Malaysia, perhaps you could start.
Well, Malaysia is a very interesting country. It's a beautiful place and so on, but the labor situation there is such that they employ millions of foreign migrants in a variety of occupations, electronics being one of them, but also in palm oil plantations, agriculture, and so on. So millions of people come from other parts of the world, primarily where they're having a very difficult time making a living. They're trying to provide for themselves and their families, and Malaysia brings millions of them every year. Dan's organization produced a very revealing and somewhat shocking report really about forced labor issues in the electronics industry in Malaysia, where it was discovered through some very extensive interviewing that Dan's organization very skillfully conducted that many of those workers had to pay to secure those jobs, very large sums of money. And then to compound the problem, in some instances, they had to borrow those monies. So they were in a situation where they would never get out from under that debt. That effectively limited their ability to move around at all. And so it's effectively a form of slavery. They're in a situation where they're not free of their own volition to do what they want to do. And so we found that to be, unfortunately, prevalent in the electronics industry. And I think the leading companies in the sector have been working very hard to remediate those problems, but there's still probably quite a layer underneath the first tiers of the supply chain there that probably have not addressed those issues at all.
Dan, those issues are just in the developing economies, right?
Yes. No. Yes. Anywhere there are migrant workers whose jobs have been facilitated by third-party labor recruiters, so that's the problem that Bruce is talking about. These Filipinos or Thais or Vietnamese don't end up, or Nepalis or Burmese, don't end up in Malaysia on their own. They speaking of the system, the labor recruitment system involves several different actors who facilitate their transport, their migration, and take money at each step. This same problem happens here in the United States. It happens in Eastern Europe. It happens pretty much anywhere there are migrants at work. But the core that needs to be addressed, which is one of the reasons it's so intransigent and hidden and difficult, is that these people often continue to work for these third-party labor recruiters even after they are on site. So if a company, a multinational, is trying to embrace transparency or social compliance within its facilities, it may actually not have an employment relationship with the people who are most vulnerable in those places. It requires them to significantly broaden their conception of what their own responsibility is.
Michael, what's keeping you up in your supply system?
So I would say one of the big issues that the apparel industry has faced in recent years is the issue around chemicals in apparel. And for those of us in the industry, there was a big campaign a few years ago run by Greenpeace. And Greenpeace came after the industry with what they called their detox campaign. And they asked major footwear and apparel brands to detox, so use less toxic chemicals in their supply chain on their product. And chemicals are used in all of our manufacturing, right, and just in every industry. And so a number of companies got together in response to that. Basically, we had already been doing a lot of the things that Greenpeace was asking us to do, but they literally forced us to accelerate our timetable by, I would say, about 10 years. And so companies like Nike and Gap and H&M are all part of this coalition called the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals Group. And we have all pledged that by 2020 we will eliminate the discharge of hazardous chemicals in our factories. It speaks directly to an issue that Peter was raising around water. Chemicals into the environment and into watersheds are a major issue, certainly for our sector. So that water quality issue is very important to us. And that's something that is incredibly complex because if you go through the supply system, chemicals are used at every stage. Mm-hmm. So how do we get control of that is something we've been working on.
So Heather, something Dan said made me wonder, do you think the workers themselves see the same issues as high priority that we see from our perspective?
Well, that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of, right? Because this whole social compliance industry, if you will, has been very top down, and some of that with good reason, right? It's deriving from ILO conventions and international jurisprudence, which is important, but we haven't been able to surface what's material to workers, what's important to workers, and whether their priorities are the same. So that's really what we're trying to investigate, and also to get at issues. You were asking kind of what's invisible. We're trying to get at issues that may not be as visible. So when you walk into a factory, obviously you can see if it's well lit, if there's too much noise, But there's, sort of more nefarious undercurrents happening, obviously forced into traffic labor, which we were talking about, and also even just stress levels. Workers not getting enough sleep, working too many hours, and that leading to accidents and injuries and problems with their health. So actually, what we're doing of surveying workers and getting self-reported information from them is still relatively new, but we're also thinking about the next frontier and even how can we capture data from workers through wearables potentially to corroborate or be able to analyze their self-reported data about stress levels or satisfaction levels with actually activity levels or heart rate monitors to get a more three-dimensional picture.
That's really exciting. So I'm going to ask some more questions, but we don't want to wait till the end. So if you have a burning question on the topic that's being discussed at the time, you can go to one of the mics, and if I don't see you, somebody will point for me. And I also have encouraged the panelists to speak to one another. So hopefully we can build this into a little more dynamic conversation. And I want to start with asking the question, I don't want to go down the rat hole of compliance, codes of conduct and audits and all of that. But what I do want to ask is what companies should be doing in their own operations, what decisions they can be making that actually change the incentives or the behavior within the supply system writ large. And Michael, I'm curious whether you've made changes, not about how you control or influence, I should say, your suppliers, but what you do at Levi's that makes a change. And Bruce, I want to know specifically whether you've ever asked one of your customers to change something in order to improve the supply chain. And Dan and Heather, any thoughts you have about what you've seen or would like to see companies do and how they manage their own operations?
I would say that there's some fundamental business decisions that you can make as you're sourcing your product. And so one of the things that we've been doing for the past several years, and one of the trends that's happening in the industry, is really consolidating your source base. Reducing the number of suppliers that you work with and moving your business to fewer, more capable vendors. If we think about all of the requirements that we're now layering onto our vendors, right, from labor standards to improving workers' well-being to chemical standards to environmental standards, it's really a mind-boggling array of requirements that we have added to simply making a product. And it is only those larger, more capable vendors who have multiple facilities in multiple countries, who are big multinational enterprises in and of themselves, that can actually manage these kinds of requirements. So I would say that's one thing that we've done. We've actually reduced the size of our source base by about 30% over the past couple of years.
What about design? Do these issues play a role? You brought up the issue of chemicals, so presumably that's got to play a role in product design.
You can build, what we are doing is building sustainability requirements and basically constraints into our innovation process. And so we have an innovation center that's literally a few blocks down the street from Levi's headquarters in San Francisco, where we're developing new products, basically new innovations for what we put out there in the market. And the people there are actually working to use less harmful chemicals. So it's part of their mandate as they invent the new products to churn out products that are more sustainable. So it does definitely start with design. I would say the other thing that you can do is, in addition to reducing the size of your source space, one of the things that we've done is tried to create a set of incentives beyond just telling our suppliers, here's what you have to do, right? So we've actually been able to partner with the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, that basically is the private sector lending arm of the World Bank. And so they have agreed with us that if our vendors score better on our sustainability metrics, then through a trade financing program that they have, those vendors will get a lower interest rate on their trade financing. And so it is an actual money in your pocket incentive for our vendors to actually score better on our sustainability metrics. This is the first time they've done this. They're in the process of talking to other companies now to put this in place. But I am thrilled about it because instead of saying to our vendors, we're going to take business away from you if you don't do this, we're actually going to be able to say to them now, hey, if you do better on sustainability, you can actually get more money. And that's the kind of incentive that we need to figure out and create and put out there for our vendors.
As we see sustainability built into capital markets more, I think that's going to be a huge driver that we've been missing at the table. Bruce?
Yeah, let me
try to address, we'll go to the audience.
Let me try and address the question that you asked. So one of the things we're plagued with in electronics, well, actually probably all supply systems that you mentioned, are conflicting messages. So unfortunately, we're still at a stage where the sustainability discussion may be isolated from other discussions about, cost, delivery, et cetera. And I have had occasion where I've said to major customers, look, we had a very productive discussion here. I thought we had a meeting of the minds about what we should be doing going forward, but then your buyers came in and gave conflicting signals to my colleagues. And sometimes it will happen immediately thereafter. Other times it may be a little isolated in terms of timing and so on, but they'll have said, look, sometimes explicitly they'll say, forget that requirement we gave you about limiting the working hours in your factories. We need this product by X date, do whatever it takes. And the iterations that we're seeing in the electronics industry are getting shorter and shorter. Some of the Asian OEMs whom we work with are putting out new cell phones, new models every 6 months, which is remarkable. So it's incredibly fast moving. And so in order to gear up for large volume products in particular, just puts terrible demand on our factories. And there are already issues, with labor in many parts of the world. Surprisingly, in South China, where some of the largest factories are, we have labor shortages. So when you contend with all those things, it can kind of just blow away what you're trying to do in terms of social responsibility, unfortunately.
Just to note that that's you speaking from the perspective of a $26 billion company having difficulty pushing back on your customers, much less a small, financially unstable apparel manufacturer or other producer. So just wanted to make that point.
Well, and I wonder how many times the business people who are coming in for the negotiation bring the sustainability people in with them and make it one conversation.
Well, ours are good about it, but nevertheless, things will then still turn around later on. The motivation to get that product to the market and hit, timing can be everything with a product these days. It can completely fall flat if the timing is not right.
So we have a question in the audience. Oh, sorry.
No, I would just add that our experience of having sustainability embedded as part of the supply chain means that it is our chief supply chain officer who owns not only delivering the product on time at the right price, but also making sure that sustainability is embedded in what we're doing. And so I do think it does make a difference having that, because to hit our sustainability targets is part of the requirement of our product development people, our sourcing people, as well as me. So it's all of our leadership team within the supply chain that has to hit those sustainability metrics. So I think that's really a critical aspect of it. You've got to build it into people's objectives. Number one, particularly, to build it in your supply chain, people's objectives. I think the other thing that makes a difference, and again, this is just basic business, and at the risk of getting too much into supply chain details, improving your planning capability is huge, right? Especially in industries like ours where, it's fast, the turnaround is quick, you're churning out new products, and how do you create much better planning systems and coordinate that with your vendors so that there's much more transparency and predictability and visibility? I mean, that's what our vendors want. They don't want that fluctuation, right? That is what creates the overtime peaks and valleys, and the production peaks and valleys. So the more we can smooth that out, and that's just better planning systems and processes.
Agreed.
I do have to say we're in the B2B company as well, and it's very difficult when you're downstream from the primary planner of the inventory. So let me go to the mic. Here.
Hi, my name is Melissa McMorrow. I'm an architect in manufacturing with Solar City. And so my question is to Levi's, the Levi guy. I'm sorry for
Michael.
Michael, yeah.
About chemicals and chemical delivery and standardization across international markets. If you're saying to reduce your vendors to, I guess, just reducing the number, I'm not exactly sure how to phrase the question, but, as, in different countries there are different regulatory requirements in terms of usage of chemicals, and the more regulations there are, the higher the cost. So I'm just wondering, like, in terms of, like, approach to standardization of how you treat those chemicals, do you have any advice as to, are you standardizing across the board with your use of chemicals between, like, anything going on in the U.S. and any manufacturing going on abroad? Or has your companies kind of made a much more, like a different approach for each country based on requirements?
Mm-hmm. So the approach is global. We've had in the industry for years every company pretty much has something called a restricted substances list, which are chemicals that are prohibited to be used in the manufacture and of the product. And that is really based on the highest level of regulation that we find in the world, which is generally in Europe, because of the REACH standards that they have there. And so that is what the chemical restricted substances list is pretty much based on. But we generally take the highest or the most stringent requirement from whatever country exists in the world, because our products are global. We're shipping them everywhere. And so we can't be sure that, this product that was made under these conditions isn't going into the market where that chemical is regulated. So we have to have the highest standard and then just apply that globally. We can't vary by country.
But you're saying, like, but that, I'm not sure if this is on anymore.
Yeah.
But that is just in your end product, right? Not in the manufacturing process?
What we've just developed over the past couple of years is what we call a manufacturing restricted substances list.
Okay.
So it is a list to our vendors of the chemicals that they are not going to be able to use as well in the manufacturing process.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's where the industry is headed. The other thing that we're all headed this way. And the other thing that, when we talk to our chemical vendors, and there really aren't that many in our sector, right? There's probably a half a dozen big ones that are supplying everybody. Their R&D departments get this. They get that green chemistry is happening and it's coming, and that regulation is increasing, right? Everything that we ingest, that we put on our bodies, that we have around us is getting more and more regulated. The chemical companies get that. And they don't want to put all of their R&D dollars into a chemical that is going to be regulated out of existence in another few years. So they're actually more and more willing to partner with us on that R&D to find that greener chemistry, which is a really encouraging trend. I've been actually kind of surprised. But if you're them, you figure, yep, that's what we have to do to survive for the future. They don't want to be creating product streams of chemicals that are going to be regulated out of existence.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Marilyn Chamate. I'm here with Awaken Villages, which is a spin-off of Stanford, and we're trying to build houses of the future. My question is also towards Michael, and it goes about, we have heard a lot about changing the supply cycle from an element perspective, so to say. So how can we best go about minimizing resources? But I was thinking about, how do you perceive the approach, like, for example, Nestle, which approach is more holistic, and they look at the supply chain and look at the farmer from, like, everybody in that supply chain, and how can their product benefit to the people that work on their product, so enhancing the lifestyle of the human being. So, like, I think this is also a part of sustainability, to look not only at elements but also at the people that are participating in getting our, like, pans to where in the US.
So I think this is a question for everybody, really, which is, it goes back to your earlier point about how we look at it holistically and improve the quality of life for
Yeah,
everybody,
exactly.
even all the way at the other end of the supply chain.
Yeah.
So, again, I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier was we're trying to move from compliance and protecting people's rights to how do we improve people's lives. And this is our worker well-being program that we're working with some of our key direct vendors on this. And we're actually, I mean, to Heather's point, we're actually, instead of assuming that, the workers in a factory need X, we've actually gone out and surveyed the workers and said, so what do you need? Besides compliance, what is it that is most important to you? And we've done this in 5 of our vendors around the world, and they come back with, we need healthcare, we want better healthcare, we want financial services, we want better education for our kids. I mean, these are the things that are important to them. And then based on that, we're now developing programs and working with local groups to put together programs for the vendors. And we're actually saying to the vendors, this isn't a program that our foundation is going to make a grant to support that will benefit workers for the period of the grant, and then when the grant is over, it goes away. We're saying to our vendors, this is a program that we need you to own and integrate into your operations so that it lasts forever for your workers. So it is definitely a sustainable kind of a program. Okay. So we're shifting it from that philanthropic approach to how do you embed it in the way that our vendors are actually operating.
Yeah.
You know, I assume like Flextronics, right? You've got these kinds of programs. You're the kind of vendor we want, right? You've embedded these kinds of programs into the way that you operate. And so that's what we're looking to the apparel factories to do as well. And
yeah, just one note I would add, you know, you do have to keep in mind the size and scale of your supply chain. So I think there's probably much closer to direct line of sight between a cocoa farmer in West Africa or wherever and Nestle. One thing we've learned in the electronics industry through dealing with the conflict minerals regulation that's come into place is that we had very limited or zero visibility all the way into the raw materials that go into those products. And we've gained a lot of knowledge through the process of disclosing information about that subject, but we still have very little influence whatsoever on those lower tiers in the supply chain.
There's also an interesting challenge in the conflict minerals, if I may. You may want to speak to this, which is collateral damage, potential collateral damage from some of the actions that are meant in good faith. Right?
Well, I mean, this is a personal view, but I mean, I think it's still an experiment. I would say conflict minerals disclosure. The law was aimed at affecting events on the ground, the conditions in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the adjacent countries, by means of disclosure. I think the jury's still out as to whether or not that's an effective way of affecting a protracted conflict, and as you're referring or alluding to, and also without impact to those artisanal miners and so on. Are we actually going to improve or perhaps do something to the detriment of economic conditions there? It's very complex, and disclosure scheme may not be the way to go about doing it.
Heather and Dan, any comments on?
Yeah, I mean, I want to come back to what Michael was saying about, you know, there has to be business value for the vendors in offering these types of services, and I think part of making that case is measuring, you know, what is the value in connecting, because, you know, as Bruce said, huge problems with the turnover in China, and labor shortages in southern China. So if you have 15% turnover a month, you know, you're facing a huge cost to rehire and retrain your workforce, whether you're measuring it or not. And so if you can also measure the value of offering some of these worker well-being programs, I mean, look at the benefits that, you know, a company like Facebook has to offer to its employees. You know, how do we bring that same HR mindset to a manufacturing workforce so that it's not about, you know, workers being expendable, but actually how can we equate productivity and worker satisfaction, worker well-being, and health?
And we've actually been able to, through the Business for Social Responsibilities, HER project, which stands for Health Enables Returns, and that you all may participate in this.
Participate as well, yes.
As well, right? So this is a program that does peer-to-peer education for women workers on women's reproductive health issues. And we've found through that program and studies of that program that there's actually a 4-to-1 return on the investment. So every dollar that is invested in this program, educating women workers, is $4 returned in reduced turnover, absenteeism, and tardiness at the vendor level.
Yeah, and we did surveys on Her Finance, the financial literacy program, and found, we asked workers before and after, did they think this was a good place to work, a good factory to work? And we found afterwards 81% of workers said they felt it was a great place to work. So, then you start to connect to philosophies like, here we have 100 best companies to work for, and, thinking about positive competition, I think, even among suppliers. Because the whole social compliance space has been riddled with, if you think about behavioral psychology and punishment versus rewards, it's been all about punishment, So how can we bring a rewards and incentives mindset to this and help factories actually compete on positive attributes?
At our last...
Sorry.
Just a quick thing. At our last vendor summit, so once a year we bring all our vendors globally together in San Francisco. And we had one of our vendors that was implementing this program talk about the program, and they were literally the only person in that whole week-long summit, including our CEO, that got a standing ovation. So it was a vendor presenting to other vendors about this work that they had been doing on worker well-being and the HER project, and there is that competition that you can create between the vendors. And we've now told all of our key vendors that by 2020, they all need to be implementing these kinds of worker well-being programs. So it will become a business requirement for us, which is how we're going to do this, which is how we're going to get to that next level.
And I think the question that I know we're all grappling with, but I will throw on the table, is given these positive models, given the fact that you have demonstrated at Levi's that this can work, given that we have these approaches that we know work, basic human resources practice says treat your workers well, they'll be more productive for you. This is not, like we've proven it again, but it's not entirely new. The question that we have to ask ourselves is why is it still a relative handful of companies that are doing this sort of stuff? And the answer is in what Bruce was talking about also, or a further question is, when companies don't act on their own, regulation gets involved, and sometimes the regulation is not good enough or a blunt instrument or leads to the sort of collateral damage, but at the same time, in the absence of a force from outside, this voluntary effort has come tremendously far since Michael's work in 1991 and a relative handful of other companies, but it's still a relative handful of companies. And most companies that make most of the stuff in the world, particularly those that are not common Western brands, are still hiding in the shadows waiting to be exposed rather than taking the kind of efforts that we know could be very impactful and adopting the models that we already know are in place.
Great. So I'm going to go back to the audience. We might have to hit a lightning round soon, but for now, let's keep
Great. Well, this is actually a perfect transition to my questions. I'm Ian Monroe. I teach courses on supply chain sustainability and climate change at Stanford University and run a small startup called Oroweco that tracks personal impacts on climate and gamifies that. And my question is really, how do we get beyond the NGO naming and shaming of bad actor companies and the government regulation of sustainability, which certainly we always need more of, but really integrate sustainability into supply chains in a holistic, incentivized fashion where there's these virtuous cycles where companies and brands are constantly trying to compete to just get quantitative, even small improvements in sustainability. And that's actually quantitative information that ultimately is transferred to consumers so that sustainability is driven by consumer decision making, so that companies are rewarded for even, say, a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per pair of jeans. And Levi's can then come out and even get rewarded for an 11% reduction. So how do we get beyond naming and shaming and regulation-driven sustainability to really consumer decision-making driven sustainability that traces back to quantitative sustainable metrics?
I personally am a bit of a skeptic as far as consumer behavior coming on quickly to drive things into the supply chain. As I travel around the world, visiting with colleagues and so on, I see, unfortunately, a lot of the worst things in the Western world being replicated and so on. And, it's driven by cost, convenience. You see single servings of various kinds in Asia disposed of everywhere. They're doing exactly what we've done for many, many years. And I just don't see enough people caring about these sorts of things. I think we need to keep pushing on, the levers that we've got. Kathrin's company and my own are heavily involved in the EICC, the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, membership has grown quite a bit, and I think we can keep pushing downwards into our supply chains to change behavior. But there have been article after article about abuses in supply chains, and I don't see meaningful change happening via consumers. I really don't.
There is a philosophical question, too, over whether it's better to make your toilets more efficient, as Peter was talking about earlier, or to convince people not to flush them as often, which is a harder row to hoe, I think.
So I have a slightly different view, being a consumer product company, and I would say that, for me, the key is exactly what you're talking about. How do we activate the marketplace and make economics work for us? And so we can't wait for the consumer to demand things. It's not going to happen, right? We as consumer-facing brands need to go out and educate the consumer and engage the consumer. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's what I think we need more consumer-facing brands to do, is to say, here's why you ought to care. Think about it, right? We have convinced people, we meaning, right, consumer product companies have convinced people for the past 60 years through our marketing departments how to buy a whole bunch of stuff that they don't really need. We're extremely effective at convincing people to do something. And I think we need to unleash our marketing departments to start convincing people to buy products that are more sustainable for the planet. And I actually think that consumers in China that are suffering through pollution that's much, just as bad as any that we experienced here 20, 30 years ago in the US, and consumers in India are not going to be that hard to convince if we make the marketing case effectively to them. And I do think, like with the EICC, the apparel industry has the Sustainable Apparel Coalition that's trying to set up those metrics that are industry-wide that then we can all agree on, and then we will compete on those metrics that we've all agreed to. See who can outdo each other. That's what we need.
Nicole.
Hi, Nicole Piel-Malter from Akamai Technologies. We're a large cloud computing company, if you haven't heard of us. So I'm in the sustainability, run the sustainability at Akamai. And I think that the one lesson I learned is on the environmental side is you move things quickly when you have a strong business case. So I think you touched on it earlier, which is so having your customers pushing on you to do something, that's one of the strong business cases you can bring your executive management. The second one is, I think you alluded to it, which is it improves your productivity, it reduces your churn, it reduces your costs, it reduces your risk. Those are all very strong business drivers for vendors. And is there something being done systematically to generate the data needed to show these are the numbers for your business case in your industry? So the factory workers who are making clothes, the electronics workers, to show those vendors, look, we want you to do this, but here's the business value to you directly, cost savings, you can beat your competition, increase productivity, time to market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think those hardcore business data and numbers, those KPIs, as eBay showed, that speaks to the guys running those companies, those people running the companies, to make the change very quickly.
I will only say, I think you're absolutely right, and I think Michael's example demonstrates that there's at least a couple of companies looking in that direction. But that argument breaks down if those employers can rely on illegal workers who they don't have to pay. And that's often, or who essentially are forced to work there.
But if they're getting sick, if they're getting hurt and they can't work, then the guy who has the factory that has happy workers,
so long as the information flow and the requirements flow down and the information flows up efficiently, information that captures, as Heather was saying, the input of the workers themselves. If that happens, then that system can be made to work efficiently. If those information flows or the requirements are not in place, or if it's leaky because of illegal activity, intentional or otherwise illegal activity, it can't take hold as quickly.
I think the information, the ROI is out there, right? We don't need to do more business cases for all of this, right? I think the information exists. I think how you convince management or owners to change their behavior is the challenge. And they have the information, right? But how are they going to make the decision? So I think they're convinced through peers. So you get other, business competitors to show, here's what we're doing that's better than you. That's number one. I think the other thing is you set in place those incentives, like I was mentioning. And frankly, the other thing is happening is, most of you in this room are an example of it. The generational change is happening. The factory owners that we're dealing with now, we see the next generation coming up. I mean, these are people who've been educated in Western universities. They get sustainability, they know it, they're starting to commit to it. So I'm actually really encouraged seeing that trend. There is a new generation that's coming into ownership and leadership in our vendor base that gets this. And they have the ROI information and they're starting to implement it. So that's really encouraging to me.
I have one question I want to sneak in here before I go back. Are we sometimes being too paternalistic? I certainly know, in our supply chains, particularly in places like China, where people go from rural towns to the city because they want to work their butts off for a certain period of time and make enough money to be able to go home. And we're saying, no, you can't work that overtime. Are we being too paternalistic? How do we manage that?
Well, that's a subject of debate oftentimes, in our meetings. The fact of the matter is that in some locations, whether it's Malaysia or in China and so on, we're not only employing all those individuals, we're housing them and we're feeding them. At our largest campus in South China, we're preparing 150,000 meals a day. And it's an enormous undertaking. But when you get into their working conditions, to some extent, you have to impose some limits, and it may be viewed as paternalistic because those individuals are there oftentimes for very short duration. They just want to earn as much as they possibly can, and sometimes they will work themselves, beyond what you consider to be a prudent number of hours. On the other hand, it doesn't always manifest itself in injuries and bad results and so on. And so maybe there needs to be a bit of flexibility, but there are certainly some points where you have to say enough. You should not exceed that.
Yeah.
We're mostly talking about producing in locations where workers are prohibited from organizing among themselves. So in China, there are no unions that represent workers independently. In Malaysia, these foreign workers are legally not able to join trade unions. So not that unions are a panacea, they're not. But the answer to your question, typically in mature industrial relations, has involved some conversation, sometimes it's bargaining, sometimes it's not, between workers or groups of workers and their employers. In places where that's not possible, we have to adopt other approaches. Some of those approaches have to be, as Heather suggested, and as we've been doing for years also, talking to workers directly, be it face-to-face or through technology. And in some cases, it has to be setting a limit that is in accordance with law and accordance with international conventions. But you don't know if it's paternalistic unless you've actually discussed it with the workers themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I've been given the high five. So what I want to do, sorry, Michael. What I'm going to do is ask the people who are at the mic to ask your questions quickly. We'll get 3 questions, and then each panelist can pick a question to answer. How's that sound?
That's good.
All right. So I think we're on the left. Yes.
I'll try to do this quickly. Chris Page from Yahoo. Chemistry question. The way regulation works in this country around chemicals is it's kind of a toxic shell game, where you have chemicals that are regulated by the FDA, and then tens of thousands of substitute chemicals that are basically innocent until proven guilty. So how do you avoid the incentives? And Michael touched on this with sort of higher standards, but how do you avoid the incentives under time pressure and everything to just get that bad chemical out of the way and then take an untested chemical and put it in your product that may actually be worse?
Good question. Okay, so how do we avoid making matters worse?
Quick
chemical
answer.
substitute. Hold the answer.
Oh, yeah.
Next question.
You get to answer that. No doubt.
Yeah.
This is mostly a question for Levi's and Flextronics. So I'm Jeremy Faludi. I do green design, education, and consulting. And obviously, the designers need to work with supply chain folks to remove chemicals, bad chemicals from the products and things like that. Have you found it most effective to, or where have you had the most success driving that relationship? Having the designers educated in sustainability and driving the supply chain folks, or vice versa, or someone at a different level, talking to both? What have you found the most success with?
The hardest part about being moderator is not getting to answer your questions yourself. All right, and one more question.
Thank you. Melissa Moore with CH2M Hill. We've talked a lot about worker welfare, well-being, health and safety, compliance, chemical discharge to waterways. So there's a lot of different topics within sustainability and supplier screening. So in the world of screening your suppliers, have you guys found a balance, or do you have any suggestions in finding a balance between all the hundreds of questions you want to ask and not engaging in data vomit?
Data vomit, I like it. All right, so we have, how do you avoid substituting a chemical with an untested chemical that's worse? How do you best get influence between your suppliers and your designers? And how do you determine materiality and prioritize what you're dealing with in the supply chain?
I can take the chemical questions. So bad substitutions on chemicals, actually the industry is starting to move much more to a precautionary principle, and so we're looking very carefully at, are we making a bad substitution? How are we going to screen that new chemical or that proposed new chemical for negative effects? Is it persistent? Is it bioaccumulative, and so forth? So that is actually being looked at. We were highly aware of that bad substitution issue. Design or supply chain
maybe
or
we'll
chemicals?
Bruce to hit the design question.
Yeah, let me just comment on that a little bit. I mean, I think the way that we're seeing a lot of change take place in terms of chemical management, both on the process side and in terms of the products, is through industry collaboration. Not every company can invest in basic research and so on. So we take our lead from some of our major customers, some of whom employ some very smart people to look very closely at those issues, and then issue us 80-page specifications that we can incorporate into our own processes. But the difficulty for a company like my own and the danger in generalizing is there are major differences from industry to industry. So we work not only in consumer electronics, but healthcare, medical devices, automotive, power, aerospace, and so on. And I can tell you from personal experience, even though major electronics companies, for instance, may say, we want no plasticizers in our products, no phthalates, the medical industry is not there yet. They're still using them extensively. And so unfortunately, there's no one-size-fit-all prescription. And I think in terms of the education, then, it's a case of working with our designers, working with those customers, and trying to find alternatives that have the same functionality, performance, et cetera, but don't have the environmental issues.
So it's a bit of a virtuous loop, a little bit.
Yes.
Like some of your customers are pushing you, and you're turning around and pushing some of your customers back, other customers back.
We prefer collaboration to pushing.
Heather and Dan, what's most important? I mean, how do we...
Yeah, I think to keep from being overwhelmed by data, I mean, one of the things we're thinking about is shifting from this annual audit mindset to a 365-day information exchange among all the actors.
Doesn't that make more data?
Because what?
Doesn't that just make more data?
Potentially, but it's on a time scale that you can react to, and that the issue that you find out about is priority because it's happening at that moment. When you get an audit report that's checking for 200 things, and the supplier gets a list of 30 things they're supposed to fix, how do they prioritize that? Whereas if we're checking on different topics every week or every month, then you can digest that information and act on it in a way that's meaningful. But I would also say, right now, what we do in terms of collecting information from workers is very small and controlled. We're collecting information on a specific topic on behalf of a specific company at a specific set of suppliers because we only want to collect information from workers that we think that companies are prepared to act on. But you could flip that whole thing on its head and think about, if we had, if workers were reporting just daily on some key metrics. I mean, I was in Dublin Airport 2 weeks ago, and, they have a little, and in China they have this too, you just hit the smiley face or the sad face for how was your experience in airport security today. So if we were getting this constant flow of information from workers or through wearables, yes, it could be overwhelming, but then we end up with, data insights platforms like Splunk or Palantir that, are able to synthesize tons of information.
So, Dan, I'm going to give you the last word. As we bring all of these industries together into one humongous supply system, and Bruce's products end up inside Michael's products to be wearables to provide data for Heather, how do we decide what's most important?
The risks are identifiable and have been identified. There is no mystery as to where certain problems are happening at an aggregate level. So we know that in Malaysia, you better be worried about the risk of debt bondage among forced labor. You know in China, you better be worried about the risk of discrimination against anyone who's a trade union activist or an NGO activist. In India, South Asia, you better be worried about gender discrimination. So you can take that as your starting point. You don't have to do everything all at once. What Heather's suggesting ultimately would help you identify whether that particular manifestation exists in your workplace. But the starting point has to be, am I worried about the right things because I can tell what the right things are by the geography and by the sector.
That's great. Well, we could probably go on Austrian, but I don't think Bill's going to let us. So would you please thank our panelists? That's great.